Welcome to my world, where every story unfolds.
Today, we are diving into a really complex but incredibly important topic: mesothelioma lawsuits. Our goal here is to cut through all the legal jargon and give you a clear, straightforward look at the fight for accountability that so many victims and their families have to face.
Okay, so first things first, what are we actually talking about? Mesothelioma is not just any cancer. It's incredibly aggressive, and tragically, it's almost always fatal. But here's the absolute key. It has one and only one known cause: exposure to asbestos. That direct, undeniable link is the entire reason this whole legal world even exists.
So, where does the money for compensation even come from? Well, the scale is just staggering. Right now, there is more than $30 billion set aside in what are called asbestos trust funds. And yes, that's billion with a B. This isn't just some small fund, it's a massive financial system created specifically to compensate victims. It really shows you just how widespread this problem is.
But how on earth did we get to a point where a fund that massive was needed? Well, this isn't just about the money. It's about a fight for justice that has been going on for decades. Let's dig into the why behind all these lawsuits.
You know, at the heart of pretty much every single mesothelioma lawsuit is a story of corporate negligence. For decades, many companies knew that asbestos was incredibly dangerous. They knew the health risks. The problem is, they didn't warn anybody. They failed to protect their own workers and the public. And because mesothelioma can take so long to show up, we're talking 20, 30, sometimes even 50 years after you're exposed, we're still seeing the tragic results of those decisions today.
So for the people and families affected by this, there are basically two main ways to seek compensation. It's really important to understand both of these paths because they are very different with different timelines and, very different potential outcomes.
All right, let's break these two paths down. On one side, you've got a lawsuit. This is what you file against a company that's still up and running, still financially sound. On the other side, you can file a claim against an asbestos trust fund. These were created by companies that actually went bankrupt. That's why they're represented by the crumbling building here, because the courts made them set aside money to pay future victims. As you can imagine, each path is a very different legal journey.
Now, the trust funds are pretty interesting in how they work. The courts basically force these bankrupt companies to create them so victims could still get compensated. The whole process is designed to be faster, more straightforward, and you don't have to go through a whole courtroom battle. So what's the catch? Well, the trade-off is that the individual payouts you get from a trust fund are usually lower than what you might win in a full-blown lawsuit.
Okay, so let's zoom in on that lawsuit path for a second. This is where you hit a huge fork in the road. Once a lawsuit is filed, you're faced with a really high-stakes decision. Do you accept a settlement offer, or do you take your chances and go to trial? Let's look at what that choice actually means.
And wow, this table really lays out the trade-offs perfectly. A settlement gives you certainty. You get a guaranteed amount of money, it happens way faster, and it's all private. But that payout is generally lower. A trial, on the other hand, has the potential for a much bigger award. But it comes with a huge risk. You could go through that entire long, public, and stressful process and walk away with absolutely nothing.
So given that choice, what do most people actually do? Well, the vast majority of these cases, we're talking well over 90%, end in a settlement. And it makes sense, right? For families dealing with a terrible diagnosis, the certainty of getting that compensation quickly often just outweighs the massive gamble of a trial.
And just to put some real numbers to this, the average settlement for a mesothelioma case usually falls somewhere in the range of $1 to $2 million. That's obviously significant, guaranteed money that can help with medical bills, lost income, and just taking care of the family.
But then look at this contrast. For that small handful of cases that do go to trial and win, the average verdict can be anywhere from $5 million to over $20 million. The potential reward is enormous, but so is the risk of getting zero. For some people, going to trial isn't just about the money. It's about making a public statement and forcing accountability. But for most, that risk is just too big.
So this brings up a huge question. How is the value of any one case actually decided? I mean, what's a case actually worth? It's not some simple formula. There are a ton of different factors that all come into play.
The value of a lawsuit is incredibly personal. As you can see here, the courts look at so many things: how severe the illness is, that mountain of medical bills, lost wages from not being able to work. But then it gets into the legal nitty-gritty. How strong is your evidence? Can you directly link your asbestos exposure to a specific company? And believe it or not, where you file the lawsuit is a huge deal. Laws and juries can be very different in a place like Fort Worth versus Visalia or Fort Wayne. The number of dependents you have, the number of companies you're suing, it all gets factored in.
Now, while this system does provide a path to hold companies accountable, it is anything but simple. There are really complex rules and some serious roadblocks that can literally make or break a person's case. So you might think, okay, you get diagnosed, you figure out who was responsible, you file a claim, but is it really that simple? Not even close. Let's talk about some of the hurdles.
Okay, the biggest, most critical roadblock of all is something called the statute of limitations. The moment a doctor gives you that diagnosis, a legal clock starts ticking, and every single state has a very strict deadline, often just 1 to 3 years, that you have to file a lawsuit by. If you miss that window, even by a day, you lose your right to seek compensation. Forever.
And this is not some minor problem. Just let this sink in. About 3 out of every 10 people who reach out for legal help for mesothelioma find out it's already too late. They've already missed their state's deadline. That's just a heartbreaking statistic, and it really shows you how urgent it is for families to act fast after a diagnosis.
Now, beyond the deadlines, the system itself has come under some pretty heavy fire. A huge bankruptcy case, known as the Garlock case, really blew the lid off a major controversy. The judge in that case found that in some past lawsuits, plaintiffs' lawyers were hiding evidence that their clients had also been exposed to asbestos from other companies. And you can see from the judge's own words here. He said the system was infected by the manipulation of exposure evidence.
The Garlock case sent total shockwaves through the legal community. It brought up these really serious questions about fairness and transparency in the whole system. What that ruling did was add another layer of complexity to everything, and it forced courts to look much more closely at a person's entire exposure history. It just goes to show you that this area of law is always changing and always under the microscope.
All right, let's pull this all together. What are the big takeaways here? First, victims basically have 2 main options: lawsuits against companies still in business and claims against trust funds for bankrupt ones. Second, almost all lawsuits end in a settlement because people choose the guaranteed money over the huge risk of a trial. Third, what a case is worth is super unique and depends on a whole bunch of factors. And finally, and maybe most importantly, that ticking clock, the statute of limitations, is absolutely critical. You miss that deadline and your options are gone.
And that kind of brings us to our final thought. We've walked through the mechanics of the whole system, the lawsuits, the trusts, the settlements, but it leaves us with a much bigger question to think about. For a deadly disease that was caused by decades of companies knowing the risks, what does true accountability really look like? Is it a check in the mail? Is it a jury verdict? Or is it something more? That's definitely something we're thinking about.
If your brain's tired from all that knowledge, take a little break and vibe with my songs. Let the music refresh your mind. See you in the next video.